Hey everyone, welcome to our lecture on Noddings. Let me get you the notes here. Okay, so we're talking about Noddings today, born 1929, at least at the recording of this video. She's still alive, in her 90s at this point. She's an American philosopher and a social psychologist. She makes a lot of contributions to feminist ethics, and so we talked about that with de Beauvoir, right? The idea of feminism. We had talked a little bit about first wave feminism that focused mostly on legal rights. But then we also talked a bit about second wave feminism that was talking more about those kind of informal and social and political and economic sort of aspects of feminism, gender inequality, and such. She's definitely much more on the second wave feminism, like de Beauvoir. She's sort of old enough to be in on that kind of stuff. And so some of the stuff that she's talking about here relates to some of that. She does, the title of the writing, right? These are selections from Caring, a Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education. So this is kind of a feminist sort of ethics. She contributes to the development of what's known in philosophy as agent-based approaches to ethics. In order to understand what that is, first you need to understand what action-based ethics is. And then we contrast that with agent-based ethics. So action-based ethics is roughly a kind of modern approach to ethics. And I mean modern in the fairly broad sense, the last few hundred years at least. And that's really based on the idea that morality, ethics, things like that are based on rules, different kinds of principles that we use to guide our actions. So here, the idea is that ethics is really a matter of reason for the most part, that we need to use our rational abilities as human beings to grasp certain basic moral principles, basic moral truths, the rules that we could get from that in order to decide how we behave. So by moral principles, I just mean very general statements of morality, like if somebody says something like do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that's a good general moral principle. And from that, we might derive a kind of a set or a list of specific moral rules, like don't murder, don't steal, things like that. Why? Because I wouldn't want people to do that to me, so I shouldn't do that to them. And then we just make sure that our actual behavior, our actions, conform to those rules. Well, then I shouldn't murder or steal, etc. So when you take an action-based approach to ethics, the primary question is, what is the right thing to do? And a good person is simply defined as someone who does the right thing consistently. A good person is just somebody who follows the rules and the principles and makes sure that their actions conform to those things. An example of this is a philosophical theory known as utilitarianism. And we actually saw a very brief example of one kind of utilitarianism way back when we talked about Taoism and Lao Tzu. Mohism was a classical Chinese form of utilitarianism. And if you'll recall, it's been a while since we talked about that. But the basic idea of utilitarianism is that there is this basic moral principle, which they call the principle of utility, which is that we ought to perform the actions that will bring about the greatest good, greatest number. And then for the utilitarians, we could derive more specific moral rules, like the ones I talked about. Don't murder. Why? Because murder doesn't bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. Don't steal. Why? Because stealing doesn't bring about the greatest good for the greatest number. And then a good person, according to a utilitarian, is just simply somebody who follows the rules. And they just use their sense of reason to understand those rules and make sure that their actions conform to it. Now that is different. That's the typical approach, but that's actually not Noddings' approach. You have to contrast Noddings with that. All right, Noddings is somebody who helps develop a different kind of approach known as agent-based ethics. And the word agent is related to the word action, An agent is simply someone who performs actions. The action is the thing that's done. An agent is the one doing those things. That's why we talk about, like, FBI agents. Those are the people who go out into the field and do the stuff, right? Now, interestingly, even though Noddings is a much more recent philosopher and helps develop this approach, it actually has its roots in more ancient approaches, not all of them, but many ancient approaches, where the idea was that morality had to be based less on actions and more on agents, not the thing being done, but the person doing those things, and more based on the kind of character that that person has, more psychology than just their external behavior. And also, very often, the idea that the relationships that people have with other people, friends, family, fellow citizens, help kind of determine our ethical responsibilities. An interesting thing about ethics that takes this sort of approach is that they typically agree that reason is also important, but they also tend to emphasize the role of feeling, emotion. That, again, it's more about what kind of person you are and what relationships you have with other people, and using that to guide your behavior. So it's not just going to be thinking about abstract moral rules, but thinking about how you feel about the other people in your life and how your feelings towards them can guide your behavior. So for the agent-based approach to ethics, the primary question isn't what is the right thing to do. The primary question is, what is it to be a good person? So first you have to define what it is to be a good person, and then secondarily you might talk about what the right thing to do is. Because then they would say the right thing to do, the right action, is simply one that a good person would do. So right actions aren't about following abstract rational rules or principles. It's about thinking about a person of good character and then trying to imitate that sort of person, hopefully with the idea that eventually you'll internalize that. It will have an effect on your character so that you become one of those good people, and then the good actions will simply follow from your good character. So when people say things like, what would Jesus do? That's actually an agent-based approach to ethics. They're not thinking about abstract rules. They're thinking about what's a good person in my mind? And from a certain perspective, that's a good person, right? For Christians, Jesus is a good person. And so they would think, well, I don't need to think about rules. I just need to think, well, what would Jesus do in this situation? Because he's a definitive good person from my perspective. And so then I would try to imitate Jesus and be more Christ-like and that sort of thing, rather than thinking about rules. So that's kind of another way of thinking about it. And we have seen some examples of this, though we didn't really talk about it quite so much, but very explicitly with Plato and Aristotle. I'd also say, I didn't have this on the notes, but now that I think about it, Confucius was an example of this as well. We talked about ancient virtue ethics. So they all thought about these virtues, which were these states of character, and that was really the primary discussion, and then thought that good actions would follow from those things. Okay, so our selections in our text are from one of Noddings' larger works that's entitled Caring, A Feminine Approach to Ethics and Moral Education. It comes out in 1984. This is a work that contributes to and synthesizes both feminist ethics, like we talked about with de Beauvoir, and agent-based ethics, like we just talked about. And her major argument is that that action-based approach to ethics actually reflects more masculine ways of thinking about ethics, whereas agent-based ethics reflects a more feminine way of thinking about ethics. So the idea, according to Noddings, now she tends to talk about this, I use the terms masculine and feminine rather than male and female. She does tend to often talk about this as though those naturally go together. people these days would say, well, there's sort of biological sex, but then there's also gender, which is kind of more psychological. We'll kind of mix and match that because she does as well. But just be aware, especially if you're taking more advanced like psychology or sociology classes, that we're purposely conflating those, simplifying those things a little bit. But what Noddings argues is that men tend to think about things in that action-based way. They tend to think that morality should be about just using reason and grasping abstract principles and rules and following those. And she claims that women, or people more generally who take a more feminine approach to ethics, tend to think of more about the people involved, what kind of people they're like, what feelings they have, what relationships they have, and use that to guide their behavior towards other people. Now, her view, and this is where it kind of gets into some of that feminism stuff that we talked about with de Beauvoir, is that traditionally the reason why action-based approaches to ethics became the dominant approach to ethics in modern times is that men traditionally have been in charge of things, and so that reflected a more male way of thinking about things. But that means that unfortunately, we tended to de-emphasize the feminine approaches, right? So she argues that the modern emphasis on action-based ethics kind of privileges a more masculine approach to ethics. And so what she's arguing is that we need to revive these agent-based forms of ethics, which are more feminine, in order to give them their due. I don't think that she's arguing we need to replace wholesale one with the other, but really have kind of a combination of both. And that comes up a little bit even in the short selections we have here, that even she recognizes that there can be limits to just taking the agent-based approach. Now for her, there are lots of different people who do this, but for her specifically, she really spells this out in terms of caring persons, that the kind of agent she's thinking about are people with a kind of caring character, people who care about others, and the kind of relationships that they have with others in a caring kind of context. So again, if you scroll back there, the agent base tends to think about character and relationships. She's talking about exactly that kind of stuff, but specifically caring persons and their character and the caring relationships. And she especially talks about this in terms of a relationship that she talks about in between what she calls the one caring and the cared for, and the kinds of ethical responsibilities that arise when there is a relationship between the one caring and the cared for. And it pretty much is just what it sounds like. What she's arguing is that in a caring relationship, there tends, at least at certain times, one person tends to take the more active role, and one person is the recipient of the caring. So the one caring is the one that's actively caring for the other person. The cared for is the one receiving that care. And of course, you'll see she has examples of things like parent and child, especially young child. The parent is the one caring for the child. The cared for is the one who, the child is the cared for, the one who is cared for by the parent who is the one caring. I don't mean to make that sound overly complicated. It's really just exactly what it's like. I'm just trying to make sure that I kind of spell that out in terms of an example. And so, again, she's not necessarily arguing that agent-based ethics is a replacement for action-based, because it can have some of its issues as well. And we unfortunately get a very kind of short selection here. But luckily, they're pretty good selections that have lots of good stuff in there. It looks like more on the screen than it really is because it all kind of works together there. But as usual, let me share some notes and I can write some things down. Okay. So right off the bat on page 316 in our text, she talks about this idea of, in the very first paragraph, that the caring relationship, parent to child, say, is actually a natural origin of moral motivation. That human beings are naturally motivated to have certain ethical duties towards others And this comes from the caring relationship of parent to child or other sorts of caring relationships. It's actually, I just kind of thought about this. It reminds me a bit of the romanticism of Rousseau, who argues that, yeah, we're self-interested, but we can generalize that to other people through empathy. And it's not quite the same thing that Noddings is talking about, but his idea that this is a natural thing and that our moral responsibilities come from human nature prior to the social contract, that ethical obligations are not merely artificial constructions of the social contract. I think Noddings would agree with that. And then she says in the second paragraph there on 316 that this kind of ethical ideal of caring is not based on abstract principles, right? So she says a few lines down, for we shall not have absolute principles to guide us. Indeed, I shall reject ethics of principle as ambiguous and unstable. She says a little bit later there, principles function to separate us from one another. So she doesn't want to talk about ethics in terms of the action-based principles that we rationally follow. She wants to talk about it in terms of caring characters and caring relationships. Now that does mean, and she talks about this on 317, that first big paragraph, that a few lines down, she says, I shall also reject the notion of universalizability. Now what this means is that unlike what some of the action-based approaches think, there aren't any sort of perfectly universal and objective approaches to ethics. There cannot be, contrary to that approach, certain abstract principles that just apply to everybody exactly the same everywhere. So because caring people and caring relationships vary from person to person and relationship to relationship, that means there's going to be some differences. However, I don't think that she's arguing for some kind of complete relativism either, where like anything goes. There are still going to be some basic ideas and functions that, though they'll have to vary a little bit, are still motivating human behavior. And part of this is that, she goes on to say, in the second paragraph, second part of page 317, the part after the little header there, problems arising in the analysis of one caring. Just like the second sentence, yet not all instances of caring are alike. And so she goes on to talk about how their intensity varies a couple lines down. And what counts as caring is going to be very different depending on the relationship. And in fact, some things aren't truly caring in the sense that she's talking about. So the last few lines there, she talks about like being a teacher and having students. Now, teachers often talk about caring about their students, but that's not the kind of caring that she's talking about. She means something quite a bit narrower there. It's true in some abstract sense that I care about my students in that, as a source of personal pride, I want to make sure my students do well, and I'm motivated to do a good job because that's the kind of person I am. My parents raised me to take pride in my work. And so I want to make sure that my students do well. But I can't care about my students in the same way that I could care about family or friends because I don't know the students in that same kind of personal way. We have this limited relationship, right? And in fact, it would be inappropriate under most circumstances for me to care about my students in the way that I care about family or friends. The only exception would be is if like a family member were literally one of my students and taking a class with me, then there'd be some additional oversight to make sure that there weren't favoritism, right? So she's not saying that caring for your students is a bad thing. She's just trying to point out that there are a lot of things that we call caring relationships in other contexts, and that's fine. But she's just trying to point out that's not what I mean here. I mean something quite a bit more personal, more emotional, feeling a kind of sense of caring here. And this is because, as she goes on to talk about on page 318, kind of that big middle paragraph there, and about 6-7 lines down, that at bottom, all caring involves engrossment. So the idea is that if you're really going to care in the sense that she's talking about, you have to be engrossed in the other person's perspective, in their well-being, that you really have to have, we might say, you have to be emotionally invested in that other person. And I'm much more emotionally invested in the well-being of my family and friends than I am in my students, right? Again, there's a sense in which I'm invested, but I'm more professionally invested than emotionally invested. In fact, teachers who tend to get too emotionally invested in their students tend to suffer from a lot of burnout because of that, because you can't make your students do well. You can only help them. But at a certain point, especially at the college level, they're adults and they may fail. And that's just something you've got to learn to wrestle with. And so that obligation, she says a little bit later, when we are engrossed in that kind of caring relationship, that's what provides the obligation, the moral obligation, to meet the cared for as the one caring. If I'm a parent and I have a child, I do have to be engrossed. I have to be emotionally invested in the well-being of that child. And that's where my obligation, my ethical or moral obligation to take care of them comes from. At the bottom of 318 onto the top of 319, she kind of talks about this with situations of kind of natural caring, right? So she talks about, responding to my own child, this is the last paragraph on 318, in the night may require physical effort, but it does not usually require what might be called an ethical effort. I naturally want to relieve my child's distress, right? So that, when you're a parent and your child wakes up, you don't have to think about abstract principles and rules and arguments. It's not a rational justification. You're just like, uh-oh, my baby's in distress. I need and want to do something about that. Right? And notice that it's much more difficult to care for people if you don't have that kind of natural emotional investment there. So again, I kiddingly sometimes refer to my students as my children, but you're not really my children. And so I can't care about you even if it were appropriate to do so. It's just literally going to be more difficult for me to care for you in the same way. It ought to be more difficult for me to care for you in the same way that I would care for a family member. Right? On 319, she kind of goes on to talk about this idea then, kind of the very first full paragraph. There are other limitations in caring. Not only are those for whom I do not naturally care, a little bit later, but there are also many beyond the reach of my caring. I shall reject the notion of universal caring, that is, caring for everyone, on the grounds that it is impossible to actualize and leads us to substitute abstract problem solving and mere talk for genuine caring. So what she's doing here is kind of rejecting the idea that anyone could genuinely care for humanity as a whole, even though people talk like that sometimes. And it's interesting to compare this with something that's known as agape. I have that little CF thing in the parentheses at the end of that line, CF agape. It's not agape, it's agape. It's a Greek word. And it means something like love, but it's a very general, abstract, universal love of your fellow human being kind of thing. This is a notion that comes up a great deal in some forms of Christian ethics. So when they talk about love your enemy, that might sound pretty weird at first, right? How can I love my enemy? They're my enemy and they hate me and they want to do terrible things to me. They're trying to kill me or hurt me. Well, they're not asking you to love your enemy in the way that you love your friends and family. They're talking about just more that love them as a fellow human being, one of God's creatures kind of thing. And that's a lovely sort of sentiment. Noddings is rejecting that. She's saying that you can't really care about humanity as a whole. When you do, when you say you do, you're not really caring in the sense that she's talking about. You're substituting what's really just an abstract moral principle. I ought to think about my fellow human beings. I ought to do things for their benefit. So she's really just kind of rejecting that. You can't care about people on the other side of the world that you've never met or interacted with, that you don't have a relationship with. On 319, she makes it a point to say that It might sound so far like only the one caring has any obligations because they're the one caring and they care for the cared for. But she also does say very briefly at the very bottom of 319, the one caring, however, is not alone in the caring relationship. And so she goes on to say, we also need to analyze the cared for because they can have some obligations too. Unfortunately, the textbook editor uses that opportunity to have a break in the text and doesn't really provide a lot of that. But having read some other selections from this, I can tell you that what she wants to say is that, yes, in a one caring and cared for relationship, most of the obligations are on the one caring. However, even the cared for does have some moral obligations in that relationship, even if it's just to be sort of appreciative of the care that they receive. So, for example, a parent to child, especially as the child gets a little bit older, maybe teen years, that the child is still the cared for and the parent is still the one caring, right? And if you're, a teen and you're kind of rebellious and your parents ever said something like, sometimes you make it hard for me to love you. What they're doing, whether they realize it or not, is getting this idea that Noddings has here. What they're saying is that, yeah, you're the cared for because you're the kid and I'm the parent, but you have some responsibilities here, even if it's just to be grateful for all the things that I do for you, and that when you're not, then you're violating your contribution to this relationship. And so in extreme situations, if the cared for is so like rebellious and disgruntled and hostile about the caring that they receive from the one caring, then that can actually destroy the relationship and make it impossible for the parent to care for the child anymore, right? So yeah, even if something like, this can flip too, by the way, maybe an elderly parent who needs the adult child to help them out in old age. But as sometimes we do when we get older, we don't want to admit we're getting older. And so we tend to reject that kind of help. And, we aren't appreciative of the help. That can make it difficult then for the adult child to take care of the parent. So it's not all about the one caring, even though the selections we get here kind of make it sound like that. Let's see here. She talks a little bit about, well, then what sort of, on page 320, like that's all great to talk about caring from people, but we do still need to relate that to actions. Yes, she is taking an agent-based approach, so the primary question is, what is it to be a good person? And she's saying, well, a caring person who has this caring relationship, but you still need to know, like, well, what do you actually do? Like, what is it to care for the person? And how do you guide your reasons for justifying that? And here she thinks in some ways it's fairly straightforward. Top of 320, about 3 lines down. Our motivation in caring is directed towards the welfare, protection, or enhancement of the cared for. When we care, we should ideally be able to present reasons for our action or inaction, which would persuade a reasonable, disinterested observer that we have acted in behalf of the cared for. So sometimes it's not always obvious what to do, right? And some people might say, well, you're a parent and you're taking care of that child. Why did you do this rather than this? You should be able to still provide some reasons, and those reasons will be spelled out in terms of, I did this for the welfare, the well-being of the child. But again, notice the caring motivation is still primary. We still need to answer those questions about actions, but none of that's even going to happen if you don't have that caring relationship to begin with. So for example, if the parent and the child, especially let's say like a relatively newborn, and they wake up because the child is screaming, right? Ideally, if we're talking about a decent parent here, they care about the child's welfare. But that doesn't always lead to some obvious actions there. Should I get up and do something for them, or should I just let them cry? That's one of those things that parents have to wrestle with. And I'm not a parent, so I'm not sure what the latest parental psychology is. But there were some people at some times that argued that every time your child cried, you should get up, see if they're okay, feed them, cuddle them, that kind of thing. But then I think more when I was growing up, there was more of the tough love school where it was just like, nah, let them cry, or otherwise they're just gonna turn into crybabies and they'll never grow up and they're gonna constantly whine when they want things. I don't know where that debate is these days. I'm not sure that approach worked out so great, but that's a whole other set of issues. Anyway, but regardless of what you do, you should still be able to say the reason that I got up or didn't get up, your action or inaction, should be because you can say something about it being good for the child, not just because you didn't want to. But notice that all stems primarily from that caring relationship, right? And so she spells that out again a little bit in terms of caring requiring that we take the cared for's point of view. So the second paragraph on 320. Caring involves stepping out of one's own personal frame of reference into the other's. When we care, we consider the other's point of view, his objective needs, what he expects of us, et cetera, et cetera. And then she uses the next line there, she used that word engrossment again, and that's kind of where that comes in again. That if we're caring about somebody, we can't just think about ourselves. We have to think about their point of view. And that's when we can really figure out what's going to be for their welfare, their well-being there. And so really we can kind of judge our caring by the feelings and relationships. And our actions then are not going to be bound to some abstract rule. They're going to vary. Different people have different relationships and might need to vary how they behave in different situations. So again, you know, the older child, maybe the teenager, should the parent bail the teenager out of jail? Yes or no? There's not some perfect abstract universal rule. It kind of depends. And so it's their first time that they ended up in jail and had to call at 3 a.m. because they just did something stupid? Okay, probably. This is the 20th time they've done this in the last 6 months because they're troublemakers. Well, then maybe the tough love approach is more appropriate there. But you're going to have to assess it on a case-by-case, relationship-by-relationship kind of example. Caring acts, she goes on to say, are for the welfare, but not the immediate gratification of the cared for. So saying that I'm doing this on the other person's behalf doesn't mean doing whatever they want all the time. Because again, children don't always know what's best for them. So because you're the parent, you have to think about what's really best for them. So you have that curfew, and they want to break curfew. Well, thinking about their position, you might think, oh, I can tell they really, really want to break curfew. And it is good to take that perspective, but you also have to know that you know better, that they need to get to sleep so they don't fail their tests the next day because they were too tired. So that welfare is really important. Now 321, she kind of talks about that, spells that out a little bit more. We've kind of talked about this already, but the idea that the one caring acts for the welfare of the cared for, and we're going to judge that by feeling and variability, not rules of actions. That means she doesn't completely reject thinking about things rationally, but that's still secondary to the feeling. If there's no feeling in place, there's no caring character, there's no caring relationship, then it's irrelevant. I can't think about having moral obligations to a stranger's child in the same way that I have moral obligations to my own hypothetical children, because there's no caring relationship there. And so any sort of rational or objective way of thinking, the use of reason, is important, but only secondary to feeling. I just noticed a little typo there in that line. It says by instead of but. Rational objective thinking, reason, is important, but secondary to feeling. So she talks about that on 322, right? The last couple of full paragraphs. Right. So it is clear, of course, that there's also danger in failing to think about objectively and well in caring situations. We quite properly enter a rational, objective mode. We try to decide exactly what we will do in behalf of the cared for. If I am ill-informed or I make a mistake, or if I act impetuously, I may hurt rather than help the one cared for, right? So that is still important, but it's secondary, right? And kind of goes on in the next paragraph to show how it would seem then that one of the greatest dangers to carry may be premature switching to that rational objective mode. So you need to bring reason in, but not too quickly. If you just immediately start thinking about abstract moral principles, then you're not going to let those caring feelings kind of guide you. And so she kind of ends up there on 324, first full paragraph. I want to build an ethic on caring, and I shall claim that there is a form of caring natural and accessible to all human beings. So again, this is the idea that this really is sort of an important natural source of human moral behavior, and all human beings. I mean, she would probably allow for exceptions where there's some sort of severe psychological dysfunction like sociopathy or something, right? But accounting for those sorts of things, people have the ability naturally to care, natural sorts of relationships, right? And she does kind of talk about that a little bit there in the last full paragraph on 324, about 4 lines down. The longstanding emphasis on the study of moral judgments, that action-based approach, has led to a serious imbalance in moral discussion, privileging that action-based approach over the agent-based approach. And then here's where she, in this selection, kind of gives that very clear kind of feminist statement of that. In particular, it is well known that many women, perhaps most women, do not approach moral problems as problems of principle, reasoning, and judgment, right? And then it says, you know, we're going to go on to talk about this later in the book, but it's basically what I talked about before, that traditional, especially once we get into the modern period, broadly construed, philosophical ethics tends to focus on that action-based approach, those abstract, rational principles and rules. But what she's saying is that that reflects a male way of thinking about things. It ignores the agent-based approach that deals with character, relationship, and feeling. And that's really the more feminine approach. And so what we need to do is kind of stop privileging the action-based approach and bring that feminine agent-based approach back in. And here she wants to talk about that in terms of caring. Good, so there's some interesting stuff there, right? I mean, she's talking about, notice she's not completely rejecting masculine ways of thinking. She's not saying let's throw out all the action-based ways of thinking about things. But she does think that it's time that we give agent-based and what she would say are more feminine approaches their due. That leads to a lot of interesting questions, and hopefully the discussion questions that you see this week will be interesting to you as well. Very good. I'll post the discussion questions, and as always, let me know if you have any questions.